The New York Times is reporting that back in May, President Biden secretly signed an order authorizing the military to redeploy special forces to Somalia. This is in efforts to target al-Shabab leaders in the country. The move reverses former President Trump's decision to withdraw there. And this comes as the country's new president, Hassan Mohamud, welcomed Biden's decision to send troops in order to deal with the terrorism group.
But some question that the U.S. government is pulling the strings for their own gain. The former president of Somalia had rejected a U.S. oil and gas deal back in February to protect the country's resources. Some are now pointing to the new president as an arm of the U.S. that will enable the transfer of these resources.
Political anthropologist at UC Irvine and contributing editor to Africa is a Country, Samar Al-Bulushi, joins us to discuss. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
So I think what most people are going to want to help us understand is what motivated the withdrawal and what now is the reason that's been given for why we're getting back involved.
Great. So I think the first place that it's important to start is the question of how we got here, right? And to recall that the U.S. never formally declared war on Somalia. It was under the Bush administration that the U.S. began to develop concerns about the situation on the ground, and it was at that time that the U.S. backed an Ethiopian-led military operation invasion of the country that toppled the government. So it's been over 15 years now that the U.S. has been involved and yet never formally declared war. As far as the recent developments are concerned, the reason Trump withdrew was ostensibly to downplay the U.S. involvement in Somalia. And I think it's important to recall here that the decision to withdraw was actually more of a symbolic one, a symbolic gesture rather than anything else, because the troops were effectively sent to neighboring countries like Ethiopia and Kenya. And from there, they have continued to commute to work, as the military likes to call it. They have been flying in regularly into Somalia to conduct the very trainings that the Biden administration now says it's going to continue. So I think we have to ask ourselves how different of a policy is this at the end of the day. We also have to ask ourselves how and why it is that the U.S. is so reliant on African troops that it says that it's there to train, right? So the U.S. never explicitly wanted to deploy U.S. troops to the front lines. That has been a very clear policy of consistently of all administrations. And instead, it is putting African troops on the front lines, knowing that Americans are likely not to care if those troops die or if they actually engage in war crimes themselves.
So why then, if the posture of the conflict is still the same, would Biden choose to get rid of, not take advantage of the plausible deniability of the commuting setup and go ahead and fully put troops back into the country?
So the reason is precisely because the U.S. troops are not going to be the ones on the front lines, right? So they don't need to worry about accountability for crimes that the U.S. troops themselves might commit. And effectively, this is why, as I was saying, there's not that much difference whether they're commuting in or whether they're permanently based there, because at the end of the day, it's not U.S. troops that are standing on the front lines.
So these troops that are going to be on the front lines, who are these guys? Are we once again arming moderates, quote unquote, who will ultimately then use our weapons and our training against us in some future fashion?
I think that's an excellent question. I think Americans have a desire to think of wars as consisting of good guys and bad guys, right? And the reality on the ground is simply not that simple. So the people that we have been training have included African Union peacekeeping forces, and they've included Somali security forces. Now, we've been engaged in those trainings for 15 years. And at a certain point, you have to ask yourself, how and why has it taken 15 years to do these trainings? And how and why are we still in the same place that we were 15 years ago, in the sense that there is no peace and stability, right? Now, when you look more closely at what has transpired, many of the troops have defected. Many of the troops sell their arms on the black market because sometimes they simply don't get paid. And many of those troops develop loyalties with other entities that makes it a far more gray area situation than we would like to believe, from here in the United States.
Right, you're absolutely right, and it's not even by Americans, thinking, well, it's a good versus evil situation. It's the government, it's the experts, the so-called experts responsible for these policies who act that way, even though time and time again we see it's not the case. And Biden, did chart a very different course in Afghanistan, but now we have this involvement in Ukraine. We have this involvement elsewhere, and is there a sense that we use these proxy battles, that we have other people and we're behind them and we're moving them and motivating them, but we're having them fight our battles for us because there is no appetite among the American people for actual direct confrontation involving American forces?
That's absolutely right. We've been relying on proxies, and what the U.S. government, again, over consistent administrations has done is enact laws and procedures that make it possible for us to rely on proxies, right? So it makes it possible for us to direct funds. It makes it possible for us to go and do the trainings. And most Americans have no idea that 22,000 African peacekeeping troops have been on the ground for the last 15 years. That's a lot of troops, and that's a number that would generate interest if it were American troops, right? But because they're African, it simply doesn't. It's incredibly rare that we even hear about the role that they're playing. It's rare that we hear about their own deaths. It's impossible to get figures about their deaths, and that's another element that's super important here, and that is how hard it is for journalists to actually enter into Somalia, to do the coverage, to get us the information that we need for Americans, right, to be making decisions when we go to the polls about this war that was never declared on a country that, has been suffering now for 15 years.
Can you tell us why? Sorry, why are we there in Somalia fighting al-Shabab? I mean, what makes Somalia different from, let's say, Nigeria, where there's Boko Haram? Why are we not fighting, I guess, every terrorist organization all throughout the entire continent of Africa? Is it because of the location of Somalia and how it feeds into the Red Sea towards that Suez Canal? Is it just because of we're trying to protect our ships?
So the geopolitical location is extremely, extremely important. And as you mentioned, it's located on the Red Sea, on the Indian Ocean. And that is a hugely, hugely important location as far as global trade is concerned. Now, north of Somalia in Djibouti, that's where the U.S. military has its largest presence, right? And there, the U.S. has been competing with all kinds of other entities that have similarly been setting up a military presence. That includes China, that includes the European Union, that includes Japan. And the Gulf states, I should mention, have also become increasingly involved in the region. Now, every single one of these governments has interests in resources. They have interest in oil. That includes the United States. And so that gives you the kind of broader picture of the competition for resources, competition for access to regionally important ports for global trade.
Yeah. So that's what it comes down to, money.
That's what it comes down to. What do you see? What is the next step in this escalation, if it is an escalation?
So the part that we haven't touched on is actually the other element of the announcement from the Biden administration this week, and that is the decision to maintain Trump's flexible approach to drone warfare. Now, when Biden came into office, he announced that he would be doing a review of the drone policy. And the reason he needed to do this review is because during Trump's time in office, he enacted a designation of calling Somalia a quote unquote area of active hostilities, knowing, right, that we never declared war on the country. And so it had to come up with a special designation in order to legitimate giving the U.S. military discretionary authority in order to launch drone strikes without White House permission. Now, during Trump's time in office, this meant that drone strikes skyrocketed. And the number of people who were killed just jumped to between 900 and 1,000 people. And that's a conservative estimate. So when Biden came in, he said, maybe we need to rethink this policy. Clearly, people are raising concerns about the number of people killed and about the number of drone strikes themselves. And so we were led to believe that this was part of Biden's push towards ending endless war and that it might have a more ethical approach to its foreign policy. And yet what was announced on Monday as well is that, in fact, it's going to maintain this flexible approach to drone policy, which means that the U.S. military will not have to consult the White House. It will simply go through the State Department, a figure on the ground, but will not have to consult the White House before it launches a drone strike. So this is a tremendously worrying development for Somalis in terms of the prospect for war from the air.
So they reviewed the drone policy and said, A-OK, drone policy. Unbelievable.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, they would tell you differently, but at the end of the day, that's...
My goodness. Well, Dr. Samar Al-Bulushi, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising in just a minute.